one of the questions I get asked most frequently is, why do we have to do all these things so far in advance? Why is it that we're setting climate change targets for 2030 in the case of Paris? Under the Climate Change Act, we've got UK targets for 2050. The committee as well is in the middle of producing what's called the Climate Change Risk Assessment about the risks to the UK from climate change, which looks at the 2070s and the 2080s. And the response clearly to that question about why do we have to do these things so far in advance is very much infrastructure, which is very much what we're talking about today, and the fact that a lot of the investment decisions and a lot of the decisions that not just the government but the private sector and households make genuinely do have those kinds of timelines. And if we don't think about them now, then we arrive at a point where it becomes very expensive to tackle some of the problems and some of the issues that will arise at that point in time. So what I thought I would do is provide just a little bit of context, some of which you'll be very familiar with at a relatively high level, on both the mitigation side, the emissions reduction side, as well as on the adaptation to ongoing climate change side, and then use that as a way of getting into the panel discussion. Michael, in his speech about Paris, mentioned this discussion that's taking place around Paris about whether we're going to have a form of 5-yearly review that follows the international agreements, a 5-yearly review that might then lead to subsequent pledges and subsequent agreements to keep us on track to that 2-degree target. You mentioned, of course, the intention very much behind the Paris negotiations of ensuring that there's a transparency to the process, a transparency so that every country knows that other countries are doing what they're committed to. And then the panel discussion, Rhiannon mentioned the model that we have here in the UK, which pretty much tries to follow along those lines. And I don't think that we will see anybody replicating the UK model precisely, but certainly we're increasingly in touch with countries around the world. I was over in Ireland the other day. They've just got their act going through the Irish Parliament, and a shadow council has been appointed to provide similar functions. We're in touch with governments around Europe. We've been in touch with the Chinese, in touch with obviously Australia, on again, off again climate change committee. There's a number of these organizations, Mexico as well, coming up and being created in response to the type of developments that we're seeing in the world. So what is the UK model, which many of you will be familiar with, but just to summarize, we clearly have the Climate Change Act that was passed in 2008. The Climate Change Act sets a statutory, legally binding target on the governments of the day to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% relative to 1990 levels by the time we reach 2050. And given that is quite a long time away, what it does is it tries to provide a steady set of stepping stones between 2008 and 2050 so that we can monitor whether we're on track and indeed make adjustments along the way as new information and new knowledge and new information about technology costs, new information about how people behave comes to light. Those stepping stones are known as the carbon budgets, and they exist for 5-yearly periods of time. So the first carbon budget went from 2008 to 2012, and in 5-yearly chunks thereafter out to 2050. The carbon budgets get set periodically. They get set on the advice of the committee that I'm the chief executive of. The committee provides its advice to Parliament, and Parliament legislates those into law so that they have a legal standing. We've legislated 4 carbon budgets out to 2027, and in fact, precisely 1 week today, next Thursday, we will lay before Parliament our advice on the 5th carbon budget. And the 5th carbon budget covers that period from 2028 to 2032. It's completely coincidental. It happens to be the same period that the Paris negotiations are about. Didn't know that when the Climate Change Act was being passed in 2008, but it's probably a good coincidence. So we have those carbon budgets. As I said, they're deliberately set 12 years ahead. So we'll provide our advice next week. Government has until June 2016 to legislate that. 2016, 12 years ahead, 2028 is when that carbon budget starts, with the intention that that 12 years is a reasonable period of time in order to put in place the type of infrastructure, the type of buildings, the type of measures that will be required in order to make sure that we can actually meet the emissions constraints that will be included in that carbon budget. The other, alongside providing that carbon budget advice and monitoring, we provide an annual progress report to Parliament, so monitoring progress against those carbon budgets and whether we're falling short of them or meeting them. The other task of the committee is on the adaptation side. So again, there was mention earlier of the fact that climate change is already upon us, and the greenhouse gases that we've already emitted are having an effect and will have an effect because they stay in the atmosphere for so long, will have an effect even were we to stop emitting greenhouse gases tomorrow, which clearly we're not going to do. And so there's a need to adapt to the climate change that's already happening. And the committee has a similar independent role providing advice to Parliament about whether the actions that the UK government is taking to adapt to the climate change that's already happening, the risks of flooding, the risks that come from higher temperatures, the risks to biodiversity and the natural environment, whether the actions being taken to adapt to those changes are commensurate with those risks. And so again, periodically providing a report to Parliament with an independent assessment to allow Parliament and government to debate what is needed and how to take things forward on the adaptation side. So with both of those sort of roles in mind, a couple of other sort of pieces of context about where we are in practice as the UK. So this is on the mitigation side. This is the chart of greenhouse gas emissions from 2000. You see the blue line there, gradually falling, and the horizontal red lines are those carbon budgets that we have legislated so far. So that first carbon budget out to the fourth carbon budget covering the middle of the 2020s, and the one we'll be advising on in a week's time. We'll add another horizontal line to that spanning 2030. As of the end of 2014, emissions were down about 36% on 1990 levels, which is pretty good going. The second carbon budget that we're in the middle of now had advised that we should have emissions down about 29%, and so that's why you see we're within that second carbon budget period and nearly touching pretty much on where we thought we needed to be around 2020, which is the third carbon budget period. Clearly, the very important thing about emissions reductions is it's not, notwithstanding financial crisis, it's not like money that you put in the bank and you can be fairly confident that if you put £100 in the bank, the £100 will still be there. You may not be earning much interest, but you know the £100 will be there. Emissions are not like that. Just because we've decreased emissions by 36% doesn't mean that we're definitely at that level, nor does it mean that trend will inexorably continue. The decrease in emissions is a function of actions that government, businesses, households have taken. And if those actions don't persist and if things don't continue, then the emissions curve you could quite readily see reversing. Clearly, one of the things that us as the committee in providing our advice to Parliament is constantly trying to understand is how much of that trend is down to general economic or other circumstances beyond the control of most people, such as financial crises, versus how much of that trend is down to specific action that we're fairly confident is locked in and might lead to reductions in greenhouse gases going forward. And so, as financial crisis is one obvious example, but an even more trivial example. If you looked at the difference from 2013 to 2014, we saw that emissions from buildings fell 15%. A very significant fall in buildings emissions from one year to another. Clearly, the reason for that was from 2013 to 2014 was a very warm winter. We used relatively little gas for heating. And if you do a temperature adjustment, which is one of the things that we do on that emission fall for a typical winter, then actually emissions probably fell from buildings at around 2%. That's quite a big difference, 15% to 2%, because we had a relatively mild winter. And it's important that we understand which ones of the trends, whether it's because of warm winters or because of financial crises, are things that result from a whole range of factors, none of which are down to concerted action, or which ones of trends, as in other areas, that are down to very specific action. And so clearly investment in low carbon generation, the regulation, notwithstanding Volkswagen, of new cars to bring fuel efficiency and emissions grams of carbon dioxide emitted per kilometer down. Those are real effects that feed through, and we can be fairly confident will continue to produce emissions. Other things we need to take into account are not locked in. And in fact, transport is an interesting example in that context. And so Transport, 2013 to 2014, transport was the only sector that saw emissions rise. They rose only a very little bit, by about 1%. And that's because you had this combination of ever more fuel-efficient cars coming onto the market, driven by regulation and regulatory requirements, combined with people driving more and more kilometers as we come out of the financial crisis, and people are spending more on driving, and petrol prices being lower, and therefore people driving more kilometers. And clearly, the total emissions is the combination of those things. It's the combination of how fuel-efficient the stock of cars is with how many kilometers people drive. And in those 2 years, the kilometers people drive more than offset the new cars coming into the stock. And so we saw a gradual uptick in emissions. So those kinds of things make a real difference in terms of that emissions trajectory. And what we're constantly trying to understand then is what measures are needed from business, from government, from households in order to continue to meet the carbon budgets that have been set and ultimately that 2050 target. And clearly infrastructure and infrastructure investment plays a very important role in that, plays a very important role potentially in locking in some emissions reductions that we can then count on in future years. And I'll come on to some thoughts about that in a minute. The other part then of what we look at is adaptation to climate change and the risks associated with ongoing climate change. And so part of the reporting that we provide to Parliament is a sense of what these risks are and what they look like. And this is a snapshot from our latest assessment that we provided to the new government in June. Specifically focusing on infrastructure, and clearly we focus on all the areas of the economy. So there are similar snapshots for different parts of the economy. In the context of infrastructure and more broadly on adaptation, the government has what's called the National Adaptation Programme. The National Adaptation Programme sets out the actions that the government is taking and is expected to happen, whether it's government taking action or businesses or households taking action, expects to happen, and how they are aimed at mitigating climate change. And this is mitigating the risks from climate change. And this is then our assessment in a few areas based on those three criteria that you see there. Is there a plan in place? Are actions taking place? And most importantly, you may have a plan and you may be acting, but the plan might be the wrong plan. The actions might be the inappropriate actions. So what really matters is progress being made in terms of meeting the risks that we expect to materialize from climate change. And there are, as many of you will know, a number of sort of policy measures in place. There's a series of what are called adaptation reporting powers, whereby companies and others report on the actions that they are taking. There's now a voluntary process in place, but pretty much all infrastructure providers report on the adaptation measures that they're taking and how those are linked, and we can then link those to the risks facing those infrastructure sectors. There's also national policy statements, clearly in significant areas of infrastructure, and those national policy statements take the risks of climate change into account, and we try to examine whether they take the risks into account sensibly. And finally, there are also sector resilience plans for critical national infrastructure, and the sector resilience plans partly trying to pick up and take into account the risks that we might be facing from climate change. And so you can see there across infrastructure, clearly one of the more regulated parts of the economy, quite a lot of plans in place and actions taking place, but also quite a lot of either further action that could take place and or areas actually where the information is just not very clear about whether progress is being made in order to address some of the risks. And we can come on to some of the details of that maybe in a little bit. One of the concrete and obviously one of the most frequently discussed areas of adaptation is around flooding and flood defense. And so this is the chart of government range of different sources of funding in the different colors broken down on flood defense. And the lines, the sort of the dashed lines going across the chart represent a range of effectively cost-effective projects that exist around the UK. So if you were to put in all the flood defences that were cost-effective, given the local conditions, obviously there's some uncertainty around that range. That's the kind of number of projects that you would expect to put in place. And clearly one of the things you notice very quickly about flooding and flood defense is very sensitive to the funding that's provided. And so funding was more constrained immediately after the election but one in 2010, 2011, 2012. You had lower levels of funding. We then had lots of flooding, not necessarily related to those lower levels of funding, but we had happened to have lots of more funding that went in and was agreed. And those purple bars then are the additional funding that was committed out for a number of years by the government, then tapering down, and we now have funding visibility for the first time ever, and very significant levels of funding out into the early 2020s. But the combination of risks from climate change, less applicable at this short term period, the combination of pressures from population growth, pressures clearly from house building, pressures from economic development, mean that even at a given level of funding, you're expecting to see more and more properties at risk, or more and more properties at risk of being flooded, and more areas where, in a cost-benefit sense, it would make sense to invest in flood defense. And clearly it's important to say within that context that it's not all about spending on flood defenses. There are also a number of measures that individual households can take at household level. There's also lots of action that we've looked at and recommended around surface level drainage and proper drainage. A lot of the flooding that takes place in the immediate term is not because of sea level rise, that's more down in the 2060s and 2070s, but is because of heavy rainfall, the risks of which also link to climate change that then result in large runoff and big flooding. And so there's a sort of concrete example of the types of differences that can be made. If we then look at, and focusing in on infrastructure, the types of things that infrastructure provides and the importance that infrastructure could play, and as mentioned in the introduction, Chancellor has put lots of stock, probably quite rightly so, in infrastructure investment. On the mitigation side, a number of measures and infrastructure measures then become very important for continuing that trajectory of low carbon emissions that we were talking about before. So clearly a lot of investment required in the power sector to enhance the flexibility of networks, to ensure that not just the supply side measures that we're taking, so not just the low carbon generation, but also the range of demand side measures and the use of smarter technologies and the ability of the demand side to adjust can be taken advantage of because of the networks, because the flexibility exists in the networks. Clearly on the transport side that I was mentioning is fuel efficiency, increased fuel efficiency gets you so far, but if we're going to hit that ultimate 2050 target, we have to increasingly introduce low emission and zero emission vehicles. Combination of electric and hydrogen vehicles needs to be coming in, and that requires the charging infrastructure to go along with it and the investments associated with it. One of the big challenges, and Barry Gardner mentioned the shortfall to the fourth carbon budget that we also highlighted in our progress report to Parliament. One of the big challenges in that sort of fourth carbon budget period, the mid-2020s, is how far we get on low carbon forms of heat. There are a whole range of solutions, as you will know better than me, to delivering heat that has a lower carbon, lower emission content than gas does, and the current system of gas does. One of those being greater use of local heat networks, which is clearly an infrastructure then endeavor. A range of other things, carbon capture and storage and the infrastructure associated with carbon capture and storage, other transport projects, all of these things part of then delivering infrastructure for that to meet and consistent with that 2050 target. There is also clearly the flip side of infrastructure and making sure that we understand the carbon emissions that are embodied in the infrastructure that we're putting into place. We've done some analysis, or at least we've commissioned analysis that's been done for us around the existing national infrastructure plan and the level of emissions embodied in that infrastructure plan, suggesting, as you see there, there's about 30 million tons per year, maximum of, it's very hard to get a precise number on it, but a maximum of about 30 million tons per year in the infrastructure plan. You'll remember from the chart that we're at emissions levels that are around 600-700 million tons a year. So that's not a huge quantity, but it's a quantity that's very important and that we want to keep an understanding of and make sure that in rolling out infrastructure in the future, that it's done in a way that minimizes emissions and also in a way that captures, which is that final point, that when we're doing the cost-benefit analysis of what infrastructure to put in place, that captures the fact that the carbon costs and the carbon-constrained world that we will be living in going forwards. Then the second element of infrastructure and the actual action that can be taken then mirrors the adaptation side. And so I mentioned the government's National Adaptation Programme. It calls very clearly for an infrastructure network that is resilient to today's natural hazards and prepared for the future changing climate. That's the government's plan. That's not a statement that we've made. And so then that goes back to then us assessing whether or not the infrastructure plan is compatible with that. And some of the things that we've said in the progress report that went to Parliament and the government's been responded to about actions and monitoring that may be necessary going forwards in order to understand as much as anything else about whether that ambition is being met. And so are we properly assessing whether there are systematic risks, whether those systematic risks are increasing or reducing? And again, we heard in the previous session about some of those. Is there a consistent incidents, consistent reporting of incidences, and are those being collated into the sector resilience plans in a way that we understand? Is the critical national infrastructure resilient to flooding at a level that would be appropriate given the length of life of that infrastructure and the types of risks that we think will be emerging? And greater sharing of information about assets and about network resilience, and to what extent is that happening? Some of you will have seen in the government response to those types of recommendations, the government has suggested that in many of those areas, the types of measures that I've mentioned that are being in place are sufficient to cover off those types of risks. They are conducting a review of the sector resilient plans currently to understand whether they should be adjusted, but generally that the range of measures around the national policy statements and around the sector resilience plans they feel are adequate to cover some of those risks. And the question going forward will be whether or not we have the evidence and data to demonstrate whether that's the case. And so, by way of conclusion, this is it's clearly a very good timing and a propitious time to have this conference and this type of discussion with Paris coming up, with our fifth carbon budget advice going to government in about a week's time. It will be an even better situation in about a year's time from now. In precisely a year's time from now, we will have had Paris. We will know what the international agreement, consensus, discussion has resulted in out of Paris. We will know in a year's time from now what the government and what Parliament have legislated for the UK's domestic contribution to that in terms of the UK's domestic fifth carbon budget with the 2030 target embodied in it. The government has committed by the end of 2016 to publishing its carbon plan. I don't know exactly what it will be called, but setting out precisely the measures that it will take to meet both the fourth and the fifth carbon budgets once it's legislated the fifth, and by this time next year it's committed to delivering that. And we will have published by this time next year the climate change risk assessment, which is the evidence base setting out what are the risks to the UK specifically from climate change, off the back of which the government will then develop its next national adaptation programme. So all of this today, in a sense, by way of preview and things that are coming up. And I think this time next year we'll be in a better position to be able to assess where we stand as the UK and potentially internationally as well.